The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious.
The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast number 39, and in this episode I spoke to Ann Donohoe, who's a Yes Scotland activist, but also has had quite a political career involved in other campaigns. So I think there's going to be a lot in this one for you. So we'll go straight to the conversation, and I'll have a little word with you at the end. Hi Ann, how's it going?
Oh, fine. Hi, Michael.
I noticed on your profile that you're a tour guide, which I think is an interesting. We've not had the tour guide on before, so this should be interesting. Have your tourists coming to Scotland asked you about the referendum at all? And if they have they been better informed than what people might have seen on Channel 5 earlier today?
Oh, well, I think most people are, or if they're not better informed, at least they're more aware of their own lack of information from the 4 minutes that I was able to sit through there. I think a lot of visitors to Scotland assume we're independent already. You know, and even Irish visitors think because there's a parliament in Edinburgh that we're already independent. You know, people don't pay very close attention. They know about Scotland, they know we're an old country. That's one of the reasons they come to visit us. And, you know, they're quite shocked when they realise that we aren't independent. People from other parts of Britain, that can be a bit different. Some are more aware than others. And it's not something that we talk about in a political sense. Well, to be honest, one or two have spoken about it in a political sense. But when you talk about Scottish history, and the more you realise just how different the traditions are, it becomes something you're interested in. And visitors will follow you down that path when you're discussing it. I think that for a lot of visitors from England, they actually don't realise how different Scotland is until they get here. And that is something that sometimes takes them by surprise.
What kind of differences?
I think the idea, for instance, sometimes we'll talk, and every tour is different, and it can depend. You can be stuck in traffic and you're filling in time. So I started talking, we were beside a kirkyard, a graveyard. I had mentioned that until after the Act of Union, Scottish women kept their own names. So that's why on all the gravestones and in the old parish records in Scotland, you'll see the woman's own name, because I guess she didn't become the property of the man. She remained an individual in her own right. And people find that quite surprising. And if they react to that, then sometimes I'll go in, and again, this will depend how long the traffic jam is, and talk about, you know, the fact that the monarch in Scotland was never your majesty, was always your grace, because Scots believed that majesty belonged to God and not to another man.
I didn't even know that one.
Yeah. The whole Presbyterian idea that you were valued by how holy you were rather than how wealthy you were. Now, that's a lot more complex, and religious belief as it is lived out is always more complex. But as I say, I try not to rant, but I can sometimes wander off a few byways. And I don't mind talking about the Presbyterian Church, because I'm not a Presbyterian, so I can make it sound quite radical if I have to, you know, in a way that would probably surprise a number of elderly ministers that I can remember from when I was younger.
Just in line with your job, last Christmas on our Christmas episode, I did a little competition of the most absurd scare stories. And one of them was that we would have no tourists if Scotland was independent, because nobody would be quite sure where they were going anymore. Which I thought was quite bizarre. So you think that most people that come are already convinced we're an independent country? That's...
Oh yeah, if they come from farther away, they are. But it's often surprising how unaware visitors from closer to us actually are as well. Definitely second and third generation American visitors or Canadian visitors assume we're independent regularly. And as I say, people from other areas don't, you know, maybe from Europe, or as I say, even from Ireland, will look at the Parliament. You're talking to them about the Parliament building and they're looking at it, you know, and just assuming that all the decisions are made there. So again, I suppose devolution does, and it's not that they don't come from countries perhaps that have devolution, they can understand that, but maybe there's a difference between being in a sort of devolved lander in Germany as opposed to Scotland having historically been a sovereign nation, and then they see a parliament in the capital and assume that it must be again. But definitely I remember that being said about visitors not coming. I can remember getting into a bit of an argument with someone on a Guardian thread when I said that. They assume it is already. And since visitors routinely move from England to Scotland and across north and south of the Irish border, you maybe find people who are in Europe for 3 weeks and might spend a week covering Britain,
Yeah.
So, if they come from farther away, it's part of a longer holiday, and they know they're not crossing through checkpoints to get anywhere within the British Isles, whether it's Ireland and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. They're not crossing a border to get there. They're showing identification if they get on and off planes, but you do that between Edinburgh and Cardiff just now anyway. It's part of what you do when you travel. So they're not seeing, all they're thinking is that's just some form of identification, some form of security. But no, it won't affect the tourist industry. In fact, it may well improve things. I could certainly imagine that happening because presumably organisations like Visit Scotland would be given a wider brief, because certainly the Scottish Government sees Scottish tourism. We had Boris Johnson saying that people were only interested in visiting London anyway. If that's the sort of thinking that high-ups in the British tourist organisations have, then, we can certainly see that no one's really focused at a UK level on the particular development of Scottish tourism. It's traditionally been very piecemeal, although I think it has come together in the last few years to become more organised.
And one of the things that Business for Scotland have mentioned a few times is that when Scotland becomes an independent country, the amount of free advertising it will get on the news all around the world, that would be good for exports, but I imagine it would have an amazing effect on tourism as well.
Oh, absolutely. People have a picture in their head of what they think Scotland is. And if we can build on what they already see, but also talk about where the country's going, if people get really enthusiastic about that, they want to visit a happy place, and they want to see positive things that are happening. They want to feel they're part of it. And, when someone comes on holiday here, I had a busload of tourists in Edinburgh on the day after the Cup final last year. Now, this will be a sore point to any of your listeners from the East End of Edinburgh, but it was an all-Edinburgh Cup final, and Hearts won it. And it was already planned that whoever won it, there was going to be a bus tour going round, the city centre. Mm-hmm. And we got caught right up in the middle of it. In fact, the Hearts bus was coming up in front of the city chambers as we were going along the Lawn Market to turn down onto Johnson Terrace. So, of course, the streets were full of people waving, and we're in an open-top bus, so the visitors were kind of waving down to them, and folk were waving back up because they're so happy. It really made these people's holidays, On the 18th of September as well, there was a lot of outside broadcast units outside the Scottish Parliament, so I was sort of explaining to people, well, it's a year today before there'll be a referendum where Scots will decide if they want to be independent. People felt that they were part of a historical moment. That made them enjoy their holiday as well. So if you make people feel, this is a country, this is a society that feels it's moving forward, and you're very welcome here. You've come to visit us. You've seen us at a really interesting stage in our movement as a society. Then that makes them feel good about holidaying here as well.
It can only be for the best. If we can move on to another thing, just before we started recording, you said that independence was one of the later things in your political life, and we'll get to some of the other things you've been involved in later. But it's always a very interesting area because there tends to be a lot of people that are absolutely convinced for yes, and there are a lot of people that are absolutely convinced for no. And it's always interesting to get someone who's kind of moved into the yes camp over time. Could you just explain to us why that's happened? Why you've become convinced that it's the right way to go?
Yeah. I was never someone that seemed obvious. I grew up I was born in Glasgow. I was born in the west of Scotland, Labour voting, trade union family. vote Labour, they'll take your schools off you, kind of thing. An argument which I think is still being waged in some places. And it was just taken for granted that you voted Labour. We moved to West Lothian when I was a child in the 60s, and the SNP, I don't think were even on the horizon. I think Billy Wolfe owned a factory in West Lothian, so it was a kind of small business people, middle class factory. SNP were seen as being lawyers or factory owners or people like that, not being particularly relevant to working class life. But I can only talk about the views that seem to be in my family. And of course, we all believed at that time, the sort of international brotherhood of the proletariat, all that sort of thing. Oddly enough, the first general election I voted in was 1983. I actually voted SNP. I really believed in the Labour Party manifesto, the Michael Foot, longest suicide note in history, it's been called. Scotland voted for it. Anti-nuclear, roll back Thatcher's trade union legislation, all the good things was going to be done if Labour won that election. And as I was standing in the polling booth ready to vote, I thought, Thatcher's going to win this election because of the Falklands. Maybe if the SNP comes second in a lot of seats, it will make her think again about devolution. Because obviously the 79 devolution vote had taken place and we hadn't got a devolved parliament out of it. So just literally as the pencil was in my hand in the polling booth, I actually voted SNP. Now, to let you understand, I was living in a safe Labour seat. It didn't mean anything. And first past the post often doesn't. In fact, I lived in safe Labour seats right up until the last general election, when ironically I voted Labour. But we'll come back to that in a moment. But I really believed in all of that. I had joined the civil service and I joined the union, as you did. And when I moved, I actually became a union officer once I started working in Edinburgh, and I would go to party, go to STUC conference, things like that. So it never crossed my mind not to vote Labour. I was a wee bit upset when Neil Kinnock became leader of the Labour Party because he seemed so right-wing. How ironic.
I think everyone was upset by Neil
yes,
in one way or another.
Yeah, so, time went on, it got to 92. Now, by then, I was living in Edinburgh and I'd got involved in anti-racist groups in America and was involved. The BNP were trying to recruit at football matches, and so I'd got involved in it. Was called SCARF. We're quite proud of that, the Supporters Campaign Against Racism in Football, with a terrific logo as well. That was a scarf, basically the scarf written on it. And I started to meet people in the SNP who were just like me, working class, trade unionists. Now, my friend and I, who had joined together, were both trying to set up a trade union in the insurance company that we worked for. Not very successfully, it has to be said, but we both came from the same kind of background, and we had joined the MSF as it was then, and we were trying to set up a trade union and get trade union recognition. And because we were doing that, everyone assumed we were in the Labour Party and nobody tried to recruit us. So we were meeting people in the SWP and the SNP and all the different parties. And I was becoming aware of the limitations of the first past the post system. I was listening to the SWP talking about international politics and all this sort of thing, and I was listening to people in the SNP, but ultimately, as I had sort of said at one debate that Stuart Hosey and Neil Davidson had back, I think, about 1990, so that ages me. Why should I care what nationality the sort of owner of the place that I work in is? If their profits, the profits of the workers, are going to a capitalist, does it really matter what their nationality is? But as I say, these SNP folk were good folk, and they worked hard. Now, the only way they were going to get independence at that time was if the SNP got 37 seats in Parliament. And these people all had jobs. Now, I say these people, it sounds, but what I mean is all these SNP activists I knew. Now, among them, I got to know Fiona Hislop, who worked for the same company as I did, Shona Robison, Stuart Hosey, and other just ordinary grassroots people who were doing a job during the day and then spending all their free time involved in political activity, whether it was the anti-racist groups I'd originally met them, whether it was other community protests, community campaigns, and clearly they weren't doing it for a career. They were doing it because they believed in it. And even by that stage, and that's more than 20 years ago, Labour was largely figureheads and no foot soldiers. Because of my trade union work, I started going to the